complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, before I welcome our guest on, just a brief word from our sponsor. All right, Eric, Barrel and Hatchet, how you doing, man?
How's it going, man?
It's going quite well. Glad to have you on. This has been in the works for a while.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily talk about it much on my show, but I'm quite far down the sort of guns and gear rabbit hole, and within that sphere, right, there's a lot of people in it, and a lot of it is effectively paid promotion, right? It's some guy who is telling you need something. And so, when I find someone who has, really valuable things to say, it's something that sticks out. And so, I'm going to let you introduce your own work, but I should say I've, even before, I thought about having you on the podcast, I appreciated your stuff. And so I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you.
Yeah, awesome. Well, first off, thanks for having me on. It's an honor and a pleasure. I'm always humbled whenever people ask me to go into a podcast. I'm like, sure, I guess. So I don't really think of myself as something that's super celebrity-ish. So I'm always humbled to be asked to go on shows, and I don't take it lightly. So I really do appreciate the opportunity. But as far as, what we do, we're a training company. So we do have training curriculum. We teach performance-based firearm shooting that kind of fills in the gaps between competition shooting and tactical shooting. So for people who are just kind of just get better, but also want to be kind of in between, like using competition maybe to better their speed and their accuracy, but also have a preparedness and tactical sense in mind to be a prepared citizen. We kind of teach that. So we kind of skirt the line on, or kind of in between both. We do competitions ourselves. We do, take at least 2 courses a year ourselves to continuously grow as instructors and as better shooters all around. We do have a YouTube channel. We've actually started the YouTube channel, I want to say 2.5 years ago is when we actually really started. We had the name reserved for a long time, but it wasn't really doing anything. A lot of our presence was mostly Instagram, and that was honestly for a long time just kind of cool military stuff from my background and some shooting stuff, and it wasn't really anything with direction. But we finally now, within the past 2.5 years, have gotten solid direction about actually being a company, which is cool. And then we also do, a lot of people don't know this, but we actually do media services for companies on the side if they want it. So photography, videography, and those type of services. And it's not just for the gun industry. We're willing to branch out for anything. We haven't had any big clients yet, but it is something that we are interested in doing. And so I guess we're firearm instructor, creator, media dude. I don't know.
So how did you get into the guns and gear space? Like, what was your path to that?
So, I guess starting in the military, I was always the quote unquote gear queer. I was just the guy that was just fascinated with everything. Stuff that was getting tossed out and thrown away, I was like, oh, here, I'll take that. I'll keep these. In fact, when there was actually new guys that would come to the team, they didn't have, there's a period of time when, money was really, really tight in the military. And so there was guys, squadrons were buying their own equipment. Guys were buying their own stuff because the stuff that was issued to them was outdated. So I would go and I'd outfit guys with all this gear that I'd saved from previous years. That was really effective, and that way they could save some money. So I was always fascinated by gear, and then after, after a couple of deployments, I just really just got fascinated with guns, and I just ate it up, man. So I guess you could say it started in the military of just trying to find more comfortable ways to wear all the gear that I had to wear, and then in more efficient ways too. And then also how to be a better shooter specifically for what I did. And then also, I took over the shooting program for the squadron at some point, or excuse me, at one point. And so it just fascinated me. I just lived, eat and breathe that. So, and that still happens every day. I'm usually talking about guns, gear, or scuba diving or something like that. So, it still consumes my conversation.
Well, and obviously, right, as someone who, this is a hobby for me, right? It's not something I do professionally, but there is something kind of, and I think it's like for a certain type of male brain, it's the optimization, right? It's like, how can I make this run as well as possible? I've worked at a big car collection. I've done a lot of work with that, and that's kind of the same thing, right? You're basically trying to like keep a complicated mechanical object working as well as it can. And I don't know, it's just endlessly fascinating to me. But I wanted to ask you something because I'm a younger guy. I'm in my early 20s, and to me, the gun culture I grew up with, right, with my grandpa, reading Guns and Ammo, was completely different. And it seems like there was a big change. So, what kind of change have you seen in the gun industry, and how much do you think that? I mean, even just the style of training you do is a new thing for quote unquote normal people to do.
So I think honestly, man, it is evolving in such a good way. I think there's a lot that is changing in the gun industry. I mean, from when I really started kind of just showing interest in it when I was still in the military, it was one of those things where it was only like the most you could get was like Kyle Lamb's Viking Tactics DVD, or like the Magpul Dynamics DVD just came out, and it was like, whoa, like that's groundbreaking. And so it was one of those things where those videos and DVDs being accessible to the public was something that was new and kind of groundbreaking. And so, but it was always like, yeah, you could either do competition shooting, or unless you were military or law enforcement, there really wasn't much for you. And then there is this skinny kid on the internet shooting really fast and wearing a plate carrier. And I remember being in my team room one time, and one of my buddies who also was a huge fan of shooting and training, we actually would train together. And he was like, dude, check out this kid. And I'm like, we go on YouTube back when it was owned by YouTube and not Google. And I was like, holy smokes, who is this kid? And immediately the internet started erupting. Even in the squadron, like there was small talk of like, wow, he's really cool because he's actually doing stuff. He shoots faster than us, or he's a LARPer. And LARPing wasn't even in a word; it was poser. So like, there was all of these new conflicting arguments and conversations that were arising because of that. And at that point, I started to see a shift, and I was like, wow, like things that were only available to the military, and even more specifically, only like special operations dudes, is now starting to branch out, where you're starting to see shooters in the civilian sector who aren't competition shooters out shooting guys in the military. And so it was one of those things that kind of caught my eye. And I noticed that there was going to be a big shift at that point. And so, I think actually right around that time, Barrett Fallbush, who was True Exodus, the shooting pastor who was always shot from appendix really fast, and his videos were surfacing, and all of these different channels were surfacing and showing that citizens were capable of being pretty effective. And so I remember really kind of showing a ton of I was just doing a ton of research and seeing like, how can I, get involved in this? How can I, even if I did instruct, what could I offer? A lot of it was also, how can I maybe take a class from these guys to bring it back to my squadron shooting program? And so I think there was that revolution that kind of happened around like 2013, 2014 timeframe, where things were definitely changing. And now you are starting to see guys start buying their own body armor and their own kit and their own helmets, to now where it's normal. You know what I'm saying? It went from, it was a cringy thing to be a citizen and have body armor because you're trying to play like you're in the military. And there was that toxic side from the veteran community and the military community that was just berating and belittling the civilian sector. And now the tides have turned where now it's cringy to be a bro vet and to criticize citizens who take an interest and a passion in exercising that Second Amendment right. So I think it's fascinating. I've always been a big advocate against the bro vet type culture. And, you know, I've always been a huge, I would say champion. I would say champion. That's a terrible word. A big proponent for the side of keeping the toxicity that came from the military out of the gun culture. And so I think there's some things where it's like, we're starting to see that shift even now. Like the newer shift that we're seeing that there's not too much weight, as much as there used to be, being put in terms of like credibility on guys who come from special operations. It's now more weight being put on competition shooters or guys who train a lot, that shoot fast and shoot accurate and can actually show that they have room to talk because their skill sets are shown. So where I see the veteran side that still has a role to play is in the tactics side of it. But even then, on that side of the house, there has to be a lot more discernment from people who attend those types of classes, because those tactics that are being taught are now starting to become outdated because it's all GWAT era. It's all counterinsurgency era. And we're now moving within the past 2 years, moving into an era of modern warfare with a completely different set of rules and a completely different way of fighting. So it's kind of fascinating to see this whole change and shift that happened in a span of, you know, a very short amount of time. And so I think it's going in a direction for the better, because now we're starting to see finally where citizens are being encouraged and in fact almost like incentivized to be a sound shooter, a person who owns equipment, a person who takes their firearms skills and their preparedness and their readiness into their own hands. So I think it's on a very good track in a good direction. There's just a couple of things that we have to make sure that as a community we watch out for that doesn't screw that trajectory up along the way.
It's interesting to me, right? Because one of the things that, you know, big picture, I think about a lot, it is that, especially if you talk to older people, right, with this thing that we call gun culture, because look, like Americans have always loved guns, right? That's kind of a part of the both the kind of like Western tradition going back to, you know, the English longbow, and even before that, right, the hoplite who equipped himself. But in America, it's always been, you know, a land of frontiersmen. And what's interesting to me, if you talk to people who are kind of silent generation, right, so getting into their 80s, you know, at the youngest, they're oftentimes kind of confused by younger people, because at least for them, for many of them, you know, guns were something you used for hunting, right? That was why you had it. Maybe it was target shooting. And, you know, and look, I'm not trying to get, you know, too into this, but I think a lot that as the country has gotten more and more kind of divided and people feel less kind of trusting of one another, you know, you see this idea of, oh, it could all come apart, you know, like and it's kind of cringy now, but you look back at the kind of like the apocalypse craze of like 10 to 20 years ago. And it's this idea that like, oh, this society could all kind of fall apart. And, you know, I don't really subscribe to that, but I think it's interesting that in 2020, right, when things kind of did fall apart, and I'm sure, Eric, you had this experience, but all of a sudden, all of my kind of, you know, pacifist friends were like, oh, hey, do you have a gun I can borrow? And I'm like, yes, I do, but I want you to remember this conversation in a year if we're still here. And I think that's interesting, right? Because, you know, you mentioned that there's this sort of assumption of you, you know, as a you know, citizen who's interested in this, that like, it's not like, you know, oh, you own a gun, you're good. It's this idea that, and you hear this refrain all the time, like, you know, you need to be training, you need to be physically fit. And I think that that's generally a really healthy thing. because even if you never use XYZ specific piece of kit or something like that, that kind of like broader idea that, you need to be self-sufficient. You may not always have the luxury of, picking up your phone and having someone else who is, physically fit and capable of violence, at your beck and call. I think that's a very healthy thing. Maybe it would be nice to not need to live in a world where you need that. But one of the things that I talked with Brass Facts about, and I'll throw it back to you. I'm just going to stop chin stroking. But, growing up in, an era of anti-bullying, it was basically this idea that like, any kind of physical confrontation, any kind of like violence is the worst thing possible. You should avoid that. You should run from that. And look, I'm not saying like, become Rambo or anything, but that's effectively a part of life. And in denying it, pretending it doesn't exist, you sort of cut yourself off. And when things do kind of become unstable, right? When you can't necessarily depend on a society that works, you kind of put yourself at a disadvantage by not having exposed yourself in any way. So sorry, Eric, that's a massive rant from me, but I'm curious, do you see anything that I'm getting at there that rings true?
Oh yeah, 100%. I think what the gun culture right now is showing is a sign of the times, and it shows that the world is in complete disarray. And I think 2020 was I would say the pinnacle of showing that, like unveiling what was behind the curtain, if you will. And so that fully, drove the gun industry into the realm of it's no longer military law enforcement only. It's no longer, what I'm saying? Like, if you want to do business in the gun industry, if you're not catering to civilians, you're not going to have a successful business. And so like it goes now from where companies are looking for military and law enforcement sales as a majority of their sales, it's now going in the civilian sector. And what that does is it shows a sign of the times. One of the things that you mentioned, the Second Amendment, with, how it's only used for hunting. And for so long, we have or I would say the older generations have misunderstood that almost at the cost of the Second Amendment itself, where now all of these rulings that the ATF has and all of these things that are put in place are because our older generations said things like sporting rifle or only for hunting or only for home defense. I'm sorry, but the Second Amendment was there to be a preventable measure against a tyrannical government system or an invading country. So that was the purpose of the Second Amendment, which means if you look at, Minutemen from the Revolution and, colonial soldiers, the only real difference was just maybe some tactics. But outside of that, they could reload the same. They could operate cannons. They knew how to maneuver. In fact, the Minutemen sometimes would know how to hide better than the colonials, because the colonial soldiers who came from maybe northern states that lived in the city didn't have the experience and exposure of hunting and stuff like that in the woods. So you would even say sometimes the citizens were more prepared than the military. And I think that we are able to see the importance of that now as a culture, seeing, people in Ukraine that 4 days before the invasion are scrambling, trying to figure out how to shoot a gun using an airsoft model, or trying to figure out how to put on tourniquets 2 days or 3 days before the invasion of Ukraine. And we also see it in Taiwan. Like, you're seeing people who are practicing room clearing in apartment buildings with airsoft guns, and they're practicing, TCCC and combat casualty care in the park in Taiwan. Like, we're seeing how across all these different cultures that are in conflict areas, where the citizens are now trying to catch up to what's already coming. And at that point, it's too late. So I think that we have been fortunate as a culture to be able to see the effects of that and have an understanding of what we need to do as individuals and as citizens. And whether there's a war coming or not, or a conflict coming or not, it's still your right. It's still your right to be able to do that, to buy whatever you want, to have whatever you want. And in my opinion, the Second Amendment is still extremely, like it's been extremely violated. Like you should, in my opinion, if you can afford it, if the military has this equipment, you should be able to have the ability to grab it, or to buy it yourself to have. And so I think that is just such a foreign concept for literally the entire world. Only America really understands that because that was our culture. But I think we need to go back to those roots where, we shouldn't be drooling over full autos. That should just be something that's regularly in our inventory because the NFA itself is an infringement on the right of the people. And so I think we're starting to see how culture is now affecting even legislation that's coming out, where we're starting to see things almost maybe, I don't know if you follow the Armed Scholar on YouTube, but now the NFA is being challenged when it comes to suppressors and short-barreled rifles now, because an SBR is, which AR pistols we had forever, and so many people got them that the ATF screwed up and said, oh, it's a common use item. So now people are asking, or legislation's asking, well, why is the SBR on the NFA list? So now we're starting to see this shift, and it's because of gun culture finally coming to an understanding about what the Second Amendment truly is about, and about companies who have a responsibility, in my opinion, to voice the truth of the Second Amendment and its purpose. That has a huge role to play. And I think also with influencers, like, we got to stop. I get so irritated when I see just videos of like home defense rifle, or plate carrier for home defense and night vision for home defense, and it's just like, no, it's literally your right as a citizen to own that in defense of a tyrannical government system. So I think people are, especially young people, are starting to see that a lot more. And in my opinion, what needs to happen is the veteran base, the veteran side of our nation needs to go behind the citizen side and push that and work together to say, yes, that's true. We need to stand up. And I think it's getting bad enough, honestly, around the world and in our own country, where we're kind of coming to that point where there's a common understanding of what the Second Amendment truly is about.
I think that one of the interesting points in that, and forgive me if you will, a tangent, right? So Eric Prince, the old Blackwater CEO, has been on a couple podcasts, right? And, like a lot of people, I knew that term, from hearing it on the news. But what he talks about is basically why that company folded. And it effectively was complete BS lawsuits, right? That the government decided it was going to go away. And so it went away. Basically, they threw a million lawsuits at him until something stuck. And you sort of see a similar dynamic with gun rights in the US, right? That this really isn't an argument in the way, Eric, you and I would have an argument, right? Where you bring up a point, I counter with something else, we kind of go back and forth. But effectively, this is a conflict between someone who just wants something to go away, no matter what the solution is. And so it's interesting, and you see this a lot in when I say boomers, I mean literal people of the baby boom generation, right? Which is that they have this sort of reverence for the rule of law, right? Like, oh, they're an officer, they're a special agent, that's such a good thing. So if they say something, we have to do it. It's this sort of like hall monitor mentality. And obviously, I'm not in any way encouraging someone to do something dumb or break the law. But what you see, and the pistol brace case is actually a really interesting one, is one, basically a whole group of people said, yeah, sure, it's a pistol brace. Okay, yeah, I'll just use that to strap my arm into. Got it. Sure thing, man. Which is already a step in the right direction, because you're already basically saying like, okay, sure, dude, I'll get a gimpy rubber stock and we'll go with that. Sure thing, and I won't pay my tax stamp. But on the other end, when that 10, 20, or 12 years later gets declared illegal, I mean, I've never owned an AR pistol, so I'm not saying anything. But I will say a whole lot of people basically said, okay, sure, you can't arrest us all. And that speaks to the kind of, even if it's kind of passive, right? No one's going up to an officer and saying, here's my felony. But that shows a massive difference where basically people are saying like, yeah, like this isn't a good faith situation. You're not genuinely trying to make my life better. So why am I going to listen to you? And I think that shows a big difference, right? Just in people basically developing kind of a disdain for their government. And we can argue if that's good or not, but I think it's an interesting dynamic nonetheless.
Yeah, I think. Have you ever read The Fourth Turning?
Yes, I have.
So that's essentially what we're seeing right now. That manifest is that, we're coming up on the end of the life cycle of our country in the current system that it has right now. So either there's a couple of outcomes that could happen because of how generations are raised in the same nation, and how parents raise their kids, and that impacts how the kids raise their children, and so on and so forth. And so now we're at a point towards the end of that lifespan where the people of that nation begin to hate its own nation, or question it, or want to change things to make it better, right? So I think that it could be an outcome of either there's a total collapse of the system and it completely breaks down, or they have essentially it is reborn and with some changes, right? So I think that a lot of people within our culture are not typically ones that want to see the complete destruction of the United States. I think what they want to see is more of an original, or going back to the founding roots of what the government system was. Because in fact, the government system that we had when George Washington established that with the Declaration of Independence and all these things, the very birth of the nation, that changed in the early 1900s to a different government system where we don't really have a republic anymore. We have a democracy. And so I think there's going to be, I honestly, I don't know where it will shift to, but it is very interesting to see that it's very reminiscent of the things that are described in that book, which if people have not read that book, even if you listen to this Cliff Notes, it's well worth the listen and the read.
I think that's an interesting point, right? Because your point about there sort of being multiple versions of America's is true, right? So I had Don Livingston on recently, who's at the Abbeville Institute, and he brought up a similar idea. And his point is that basically, and again, this is a controversial statement, I'm going to say in a morally neutral way, right? My opinions on it are irrelevant. But he basically said, look, America is one type of country from its inception to the Civil War. After the Civil War, it is a different type of country. It is also a different type of country between the Civil War and World War II. And then you see a shift, maybe not a complete different type of country, but a hard turn in the 60s, right? Where fundamentally 1950 America looks very different from 1969 America, right? Again, regardless of your opinions. And so if you take that, mid 60s point, we're about 4 generations on, right? Baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and now Gen Z. And so I think that there's something to that. And again, this is not a news show. I don't want to get into it. But I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is a lot of the big issues, right, that were almost eternal issues in American politics have either been solved or kind of moved in a different way. So Roe versus Wade is no longer the law of the land. That kind of changes the whole, because I mean, look, like that's been a part of politics my entire life, right? Probably your entire life, Eric. So just that being not necessarily solved, like what I want to be happening has happened, but that issue is really different. The issues being talked about are almost unrecognizable from 2024 to 2004. There's some crossover, right? There's culture war stuff and things like that, but the country shifted. And I think what we're seeing is this sort of lag, right? Like the fact that China is at least in contention for, being a world superpower. That's a huge deal. That was not the case 20 years ago. And so I think that you're right. There is this kind of feeling of, being up in the air or kind of turning. And, I don't want to just turn this into kind of cultural analysis, although I think that's interesting. But I think that, even people who don't agree with you or I kind of feel this same unease. And it seems like a lot of things are kind of, I don't know, in flux in a way they haven't been for a while. Sorry, that's a little bit vague, but do you see what I'm getting at?
Oh yeah, 100%. In my opinion, I think what it is, and the reason is before people would identify with, oh, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican and I stand behind this, case and I stand behind these things. Well, now this generation, and even in the gun culture, we're seeing this, is there's just no more identity. Like, we don't know our identities anymore. And so people are struggling and trying to find an identity to latch onto. And, now now we're going into a phase where it's like what people used to consider as like, oh, like a pinnacle, like I want to be like that. No longer do they want to be that, like that, or a part of that organization. Like, I'll use the military, for example. Like, the military has its worst recruiting numbers ever because nobody wants to be a part of that organization, because even that organization doesn't know its own identity. Like, it showed how much of its identity was truly lost behind the scenes in 2020. And so you're seeing where it's like, oh, the military leadership, they'll look out for me, they'll do all these things. And it's like, after 2020, it's like, no, they don't look out for you. And then after, guys are getting booted out, they're like, okay, well, go ahead and come on back. And so it's just like this back and forth of like just confusion where people have lost their identity and don't know where to go. And so now you're starting to see these little factions form, even in the gun industry, where people are following these certain little groups. Like, you almost have these massive cliques, like, oh, I follow this personality and I'm a hardcore fan of this, or I follow this personality over here, or I still follow the military thing. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're starting to see these cliques forming. And I think that is just evidence of the lack of identity across our culture right now.
One of the things that, a lot of, conservatives and right wingers like to make fun of is, the Gen Z kind of pronoun people, right? Pronouns in bio, like, oh, I'm a Zer demi boy. And that's look, don't get me wrong. Those people are really embarrassing. They should have been shoved in lockers a long time ago. Maybe that would have solved the problem. But nonetheless, I think that is a symptom of that lack of identity. So many people have kind of lost that ability to define themselves. And once you have the ability, and really look, like, the internet enables you to make yourself whatever you want to be, right? That's almost too much for people. It kind of breaks their brains. When they sort of lose any kind of inherent identity, a connection to God, a tradition, anything that would kind of root you, they just become these kind of like disembodied, like oh, I don't know, like it's like spiritual beings, right? Where they just become almost like possessed by these ideas. And I think that the pronoun thing is kind of the perfect encapsulation of that, because you are not only deciding on a created identity for yourself, but you are demanding other people recognize that created identity, right? Like, not only am I the person who charts my own course, but I'm also saying that you must recognize me. And one of the things I wanted to bring up is that I've noticed, as a kind of a passive observer of the gun space, is it seems like faith is becoming more and more something that is commonly mentioned, right? Like, I was driving home from jujitsu, listening to a video you guys put out and just letting it roll, and I was wait, there's a Bible verse at the end. And once I kind of picked up on that, I was like, oh, this isn't the only time I've seen that. And I think generally there's been a turn to faith. I keep mentioning 2020 because I'm Gen Z, and 2020 was like my personal Vietnam. I'll never shut up about it. But nonetheless, I think that, and I'll speak for myself and then hand it back to you. For a lot of people, it was a realization that the sort of evil and malice are real and can happen here. Regardless of your opinion on any one issue, that there are things that cannot be really just explained by differences, right? Like, when someone is creating a statue to Satan and kind of worshiping it and putting it somewhere, that's not something you do if you just don't believe in anything. And so I think that once you have that belief in evil, that evil is something real, evil is something that isn't just like a mistake, there's sort of an interesting converse to that, right? That there must be some sort of opposition. And so I'm curious, right? I'll throw it back to you. Why did you guys start including the Bible in your work? And also, do you see a broader cultural turn back to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm actually really excited about that one. It all started, we talked about on the podcast, but I'd been, I would call myself, I'd been a closet Christian for a long time. And I think most people who call themselves Christians in America are closet Christians, meaning I don't really talk about it. I just, try to live good. Maybe people will see Jesus through the way that I live and all this stuff. But we had been, myself and Tyler, who's the other owner of Brown Hatchet, along with Roy, we'd been praying for Roy to come know Jesus for a long time. And he went through a really hard time in his life. Actually, all three of us did last year in the fall. And he talked about that in depth on the podcast when he tells his testimony. But he got saved at a men's retreat that Barrel and Hatchet actually did a pro bono class for that retreat. It was just like, he was like, hey, I'm going to go teach these guys. I was actually in Maryland teaching a SWAT team. And so he was like, hey, I'm going to go do this class in Georgia. And I was like, yeah, make sure just do pro bono. Like, don't charge him anything. And it's only like, he was thinking, I'm going to go up there, teach them some gun stuff, and then come back down. Well, he goes up there and he gets saved. And so like, he accepts Jesus into his heart, has a supernatural experience to the point where it was like almost very physical in terms of what he felt. And it wasn't like an emotional feeling. Like it was like, he was like, dude, it shocked him. And he was a hardcore like skeptic in terms of things. So when he came back and was like, I have to tell you what happened after I got back from Maryland and he got saved, that for me was kind of a wake up call, because I just felt the Holy Spirit just telling me like, hey, he's found the narrow road. And if he goes off the narrow road because you don't continue to minister to him, it's your fault if he turns back away and turns away from the Lord. And I was just like, man, I cannot have that on me. So I was like, screw it. Let's just start including, scripture and talking about Jesus in the podcast. So you could say that Roy being saved kind of pulled me out of the closet of being a closet Christian to be more bold about my faith, because I was seeing how bold he had become. And so it was so, last year was such a dark year for us, man. It was one of those things like where, Roy going through his loss and then us being a part of that, and Barrel and Hatchet almost broke apart, because of that loss. And Roy was just like lost direction, didn't know what to do. And there was just so many things that happened where everything was hanging on by a thread behind the scenes that people didn't really know about. And now he is coming back and he has like this newfound purpose and a newfound identity. We were like, this is it. This is what Barrel and Hatchet is supposed to do. It's supposed to be able to reach people in this space, in the gun community, to people who are constantly talking about preparedness, constantly talking about discipline, constantly talking about philosophy and theology and training to be more of a critical thinker. The gospel needs to be presented to them. And so we have totally shifted our mission set to now all the gun videos we do on YouTube, all the podcasts, even the training. Like we're starting to involve, praying before and after class, and then opening it up to people to come ask us questions about obviously about the class, but also about Jesus. And if they have any questions about that, almost using it as a witnessing opportunity. And so all of those things are just to be able to be a conduit for us to be able to present the gospel. And the reason why it's so important is because we all have a purpose, and it is bigger than what is of this earth. It's bigger than earthly things. And so, what Christ does for us is he gives us identity in him. I went through a really dark period in my life when I got out of the military. And the job that I was in, it was like all the A-type personalities were in that kind of job, and so it was one of those things like in the Air Force and even in the Army, if you have a beret and a certain color, it means a lot. And you find yourself wrapping up your identity in that beret and in that job. And so when I got out of the military and I'm a regular citizen, not still doing it part-time. I still do that same job part-time now, but it was like my identity was stripped away from me, and nobody knew who I was. Whereas in the Air Force, if I walk into on an Air Force base, everybody knows who I am and knows what I do. And it's kind of like, wow, like you're almost like a rock star. And so going to having my identity stripped away from me like that, and having my whole being wrapped up in that, when that was gone and taken away, I went through a severe bout of depression, turned to alcoholism and all of these terrible things. And now, mind you, I grew up in the church. Like, I almost walked away from the faith, a while back. And so I kind of came back a little bit to the Lord and was kind of wishy-washy a little bit about it. But, started getting professionally involved in the shooting industry. And I started finding myself latching on to shooting and my training and all that stuff as my new identity. And so I remember actually, I'd been shooting or been in the gun industry and training and stuff like that, living the dream job, what I always wanted to do. And like, I got, people are like, man, you got the best job in the world. And I did, and I still do, and to me, it's something that what was my hobby is now, and my passion is now I do it for work. So, but even in that, having my identity so wrapped up in that and not in Christ, not in something that transcends and is above the things of this earth, I almost, I had some really close suicide encounters, in the middle of that. And so it goes to show that, like, you can't have your identity wrapped up in things of this earth. You can't have your hope wrapped up in this government system or this side that's going to, is trying to fight to take over and things will change after that, or this political candidate or whatever. And I think people are starting to see that a lot of the things that are promised in this world is just fake and it's empty. And so, you're seeing rich people who are just doing terrible things because they're searching for something that's fulfilling. Or people in the gun industry just like buying things because they want it to fulfill that void. And so I've seen that pain. And so I, because of Roy getting saved, we decided, screw it. Let's just start including it in all of our content and using that as a catapult to be able to reach people who are in this industry and even outside the industry, to be able to preach the gospel to them in a way where it's not preaching at them, but just presenting it to them and saying, hey, here it is. This is something that gives you hope. This is something that gives you peace. And during these desperate times, that gives you a new identity in Jesus and allows you to rest in him. You don't have to do anything but just accept the gift that he's given you. You don't have to work or follow all these rules and go to this many ceremonies. Like, you just have to accept it, truly. And so that's when we started to do that. And it wasn't really until after I did a post on YouTube and Instagram and stuff like that, where I was just like, hey, before the next podcast, I was like, hey, let's just get together and we'll do a prayer meeting before the podcast to bless the podcast, and God would bless it, and that he would give us the words to say and to speak in wisdom. And I put out a post. I was like, I'm just going to ask the community if they have any prayer requests to submit them, and we'll pray about them. And dude, I was not prepared for the amount of comments that we got. It blew me away. Like, it legit blew me away. And this is just from the Barrel and Hatchet community. This is just from the social media platforms that we're on, where we got 400 prayer requests on all the different platforms, X, Instagram, DMs, emails, YouTube comments in 1 week. And so I'm like, what do we do? I'm talking, it was like prayer requests that were like, my brother just committed suicide. My mom's dying of cancer. I just lost my daughter. Like, my kid died. Like, real life issues, real life things that matter, and things that people are struggling with every day that nobody knows about, because we always put a front up. We always put up a face. And I was like, bro, that is what matters. Like, none of everything else doesn't matter at all. Like, it really doesn't. And so, our mission set now is to be able to provide the community the gospel and to reach them through, talking about gun topics and preparedness topics, to be able to present them the gospel where they'll be able to understand it, but receive it as well. And there's going to be people who don't receive it, and that's okay. And we'll still pray for them. But I think there's a lot of people who are looking because they have no identity. They're broken. They're living in hard times. They know that the things of this world are fake. Social media is proof of that, and that nothing is what it seems, and that it's all just empty promises and it's all in vain. And so we're now seeing real time people outside the industry, just around the world, are striving to reach for something that's tangible and real and is bigger than what's on this earth. And it transcends the things on this earth that can deteriorate and fall away over time. And that's what the gospel provides, and that's what Jesus brought when he died on the cross, man. And that's all we're trying to do now is spread that, use it as a ministry.
It's interesting. I recently had a conversation with a friend of mine, John, forward observer in Afghanistan, and we talked about his kind of life after the military. And one of the things he talked about was that kind of lack of identity, in the sense that feeling like I don't know what I am, like what am I supposed to do with myself, and how that was incredibly difficult to deal with. And one of the things he also mentioned was he had this realization that most people live pointless lives, that he felt like he was walking around, just looking around. He's like, why are you doing this? Like, why do you spend all your time, why do you waste it on this? Why are you watching TV all day? This isn't real. This isn't a real existence. And, he again also ended up, back in the church. And, one of the things that I think about a lot is effectively that, we as a culture have really lost the ability to answer that question of why. Why does society, exist more broadly? Why should you personally do anything? And there's this kind of, like limp-wristed morality of, just don't hurt anyone. Don't do anything that's, as long as you're not, harming anyone else, whatever you want is good. And I think that one of the kind of the helpful things about the time that we live in is you can see people live that out, and they're destroying themselves. And obviously I don't want that to be the case. If you could fix them, if you could save them and have it all work, that's what you'd want. But sort of living in a world where someone takes an idea that you have baked into your brain, that you may not even, like, if you wouldn't write it out and say, this is what I believe, but you act like you believe, right? And to see that taken to its logical conclusion and realize, like, oh, that's poison, that'll kill you. And I think that that's sort of the interesting thing about the internet, right? Is it's freed so many people from limitation. They really can do whatever they want. And I think that broadly, whether we're talking about discipline and any kind of like physical endeavor, or spiritual discipline, or even like emotional discipline, you realize the necessity in that when it's not something you have to do, right? Because it's not really discipline if it's the way you survive. And so in much the same way that, you and I have to choose not to be fat in the way that our great-great-grandparents just didn't have to, right? Like, it was hard to be fat in the 1880s. Now it's the exact opposite. I feel almost the same way about, kind of like spirituality and any one of these things, that it's, it is something you really have to try for. And I don't mean to say it's always a choice. That's not what I'm saying. But it is very much against the tenor of the times, and discipline in any one of these things is sort of a revolutionary act, I guess, in kind of the face of like this culture of do whatever you want, I guess. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that you'll see is everything is so counterculture, and so when I would say the typical American culture that the powers that be want you to have is to, not have a family, abort your kids, live for yourself, have your own career, sleep as many people as you possibly can, just buy more stuff, listen to what we say, promote all of these, be a part of some form of movement, right? we're starting to see people go against that. And they're saying, screw you, I'm going to have a family. I'm going to, I'm going to find Jesus. I'm going to have a bunch of kids. Like, I'm going to, homeschool my children, and my wife is going to, be a stay-at-home mom. Like, we're starting to see all of that type of stuff kind of blossom. And also we're seeing, the older generation, our parents' generation, who did those types of things that helped honestly develop that culture that is being pushed down our throats. They're living now, and I don't know if you've seen some of the interviews of like, these very successful, for example, these successful women who are just like CEOs of companies, and they're in their 50s and they are so depressed because they can't find a husband. They sacrifice their marriage for their career. They don't have kids, and now they're like, I wish I had kids. Like, I work in an office by myself. I'm too old for children. I'm not marriage material. Like, you're alone, and so it's like it's in Christianity we say that's it's living for the world. If I'm living for myself, I'm living for the world. I'm living for what the world has to offer. And that's why I think a lot of people, they say there is some discipline in spirituality and living as a Christian. It's mostly it's discipline in temptations, not divulging yourself. But I don't think it's the way that a lot of people believe it to be, where it's you have to, do all of these different rituals and all of these things and fast, 5 times a month. And it's not all that. It's honestly very liberating. It's very liberating to be able to cast your burdens and to cast the things that are heavy on this world onto him. It's very liberating to not have to defend your identity, because your identity is not in yourself. It's in the Lord. Like, I felt this huge weight lifted off of me, Roy included, when we were saved, where I don't have to prove anything to anybody. The only person I have to impress is Jesus. So like, it just takes so much of the stress off. And I think that we're starting to see more people come to Jesus, because I think everybody is tired. I think a lot of people are struggling to find purpose. And usually when things get hard and times get tough, you start to see more people that are looking for something that will give them rest and give them peace in a time of difficulty. So I think that's where the culture is headed. And I don't think it'll be, I don't know how long that will last, but yeah, as long as there's hard times, people will start to turn to things that are real and tangible.
Well, and I think that, in that, one of the really destructive ideas, and we mentioned this earlier, about the kind of shift that our country took, was this idea, and it's a corruption of an older idea, right? It's that idea of freedom. Because, when we talk about that term freedom, it means a multitude of different things, right? Like when the Gauls are rebelling against Caesar for freedom, what are they rebelling for? Well, really, they want to have a king who's the same type of person as they are. But, the Gaulish kings, it was not a particularly liberal society. They'd stuff you in a giant wooden man and set you on fire if they didn't like you. It wasn't a particularly pleasant place to live, but that was considered freedom, right? Similarly, right, the type of freedom that, a college professor would perhaps advocate, right? The freedom to pursue whatever kind of like combination of genitals you so desire is not the same type of freedom that George Washington or William Wallace would have recognized, right? And so in the 60s, we see that kind of kick towards unlimited self-expression, right? Which we see kind of in the pronouns in bio, which is, I am whatever I want, and any restriction on my ability to decide what I am, we need to tear that down. And I think what you're talking about and what you sort of see this in what a lot of guys get in military service is that, you get meaning from sort of a combination of limitation and sacrifice, right? I am not everything, I am something. And that something I am, whether it be a husband or father, requires me to give something up, requires me to, become something to someone else, right? I am a father, or I am a husband in relation to someone. You gain meaning and responsibility. And I think that, obviously, there's this kind of chain of responsibility that your kind of primary responsibility is to God the Father, right? And then there's sort of a mirror image of that, which is, well, okay, what is, with the king or the president? That's the leader of the country, right? There's a responsibility there, responsibility to your family. And I think that what we see in these people who are just atomized, right, connected to nothing, they're connected to, basically only their personal consumer choices, is that's no way to live. That doesn't make you freer. It makes you miserable. And I think that, really what we're seeing now is people going two directions. Either, well, I'm only miserable because I'm not, my own enough. I need to be even more, kind of customized, right? I'm going to drag and drop body parts on myself like I'm made of Legos. Or alternatively, this isn't working. Like, I need to be constrained. I need to have responsibilities. And to me, and I'll throw it back to you as we wrap this up, it reminds me very much of, why God limits the life of man after the flood, right? And the argument goes, right, like, you will live, 120 years, because that's a cap, right? Any longer than that, and your sin can sort of get run over and over and over again. And the idea in that is, okay, it's sort of harsh, right? You will not live as long, but there's love in that. There's love in that kind of limitation. And I think that, as someone who's, recently been married and has kind of friends who are in that stage in life, it's been really interesting talking to one of my best friends who recently had his first son. And, he's in that kind of rough period of time where he's not sleeping at all. He's pretty miserable from some perspective. And I went over to help him with something around the house, and we were talking. He's like, you know what, man, like, I'm tired, kind of miserable, but I know what I need to do, right? This isn't something I can stop. And even though it's not like fun or glamorous, the fact that I have something that is non-negotiable, that needs to be done, something's depending on me, it's a sense of meaning. And I think that that's broadly something that we need, and you see really lacking in culture more broadly.
Yeah, I think, you talked about how people are the type of freedom that maybe William Wallace and George Washington don't recognize is what people are quoting as freedom today, of just let me do whatever I want. We find that the people who want that, who want the ability to just eat whatever I want, do whatever I want, my truth is whatever I want, usually tend to be the most miserable people in the room, because they're a slave to that fallen nature and that fallen sin. And that's why it's like we think of it as limiting to not do things, to have, the discipline to save myself for my wife, and not sleeping around, or, taking and making sure I set aside time for my children, and teaching them and raising them, but all of that type of stuff, it's a discipline that in the end provides a great reward. And so I think that's something that, in the culture that we have today, which in my opinion is a sign of the last breaths of our civilization in this phase that it's currently in. Who knows what the next phase will look like, but those are symptoms of what the last dying breaths of a civilization are, where there is no morality, there is no black and white truth. And so we're starting to see where people are living however they want to, and they end up being miserable, in that state. Like, a perfect example I like to tell people is, like, remember when Portland was taken over and there's no cops there? It was in 2020, and it was just like they set up their own little, like, country in Portland, and just all of the misery that was going on in there, and just like insanity. And that is a perfect example of people who are living in a society where they're free, quote unquote. And it's just total, chaos and misery. And so I think that's where in the gun industry, I think that there are a lot of people who are already looking for a more structured life that has a great reward, and people are willing to put the work in to be able to get that because they appreciate that process. And so I think it's going to be, if things did occur where there's a huge shift in the way that society is now, I think it's going to be, that change and that shift will be built on the backs of people that are in this industry, in my opinion, because, we have a sense of morality. We have a set of guidelines that transcends this world, right? We have eternal guidelines that we abide by, whether there's a police officer in the law standing right there or not. Like, I will follow those guidelines because I am beholden to them by God himself. And so you start to see where if there's a complete collapse of society, in my opinion, it's going to rely on people who have a higher sense of moral standing to be able to kind of rebuild society, where it's not just complete and utter chaos. So who knows? I think at the end of the day, the biggest thing is, one of the things I'd like to see as a shift is also, there are people who prep and train and shoot that literally still only think about themselves. And I mean, how many times have you heard, oh, I'm just going to come over and take your stuff, all your preps, I'm just going to come over and take your stuff, or I'm going to take somebody else's stuff. And so that's not the answer either, and that just goes to show you can still be a prepper and a trainer and stuff like that and have no sense of morality. And in my opinion, those become the dangerous ones in the absence of society and law. So it's going to be, really relying on us to be able to continue to look to help other people. If I have preps and stuff like that, I look at that as, if things do happen, this is our perfect opportunity to help people who are in need, because there's going to be a lot of them. There's going to be people who need protection. There's going to be people who need to be fed. There's going to be people who need a place to stay and to live. And so having a game plan to be able to be there, to be able to help people in the event of a collapse, to me, that is something that's worth preparing for, outside of, along with, bringing the peace of the gospel and the message of Jesus Christ to be able to give people relief, salvation, and hope in a time that's really dark.
So Eric, we are fast coming up on time. If people want to find more of your stuff, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, so you can check us out on Instagram. It's Barrel and Hatchet TG. And then also on YouTube, you can just type in Barrel and Hatchet and it'll pop up. If you type in Hatchet Cast, it'll probably be the podcast, which we have on Spotify, but we also put it on YouTube as a separate channel. And then, if you type in Hatchet Cast on Spotify, we're on there as well. So for people who are boycotting YouTube, every video that's on YouTube is also posted automatically to Rumble. So you can just type in Barrel and Hatchet on Rumble and find us there as well.
Well, great, man. Thanks for coming out. I enjoyed it. As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I have a Substack, which I'd appreciate if you checked out. And then if you want to support us more directly, our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, they do great work there. I've been rolling jiu-jitsu recently, and I have received exactly 2 compliments, both of them somewhere along the lines of, wow, man, you're really strong. No comments had anything to do with me being good at jiu-jitsu. They just said I was in good shape, and Axios can help you also be in good shape. And again, man, thank you so much for coming on. It's a good time.
Thanks for having me, brother. Be safe.
And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.